The further points that he's raised with regard to whether one amendment will fall if another succeeds will obviously depend on the amendments themselves, and Mr Speaker will be announcing his selection on the day itself. Thank you. Statement, Minister of State for Justice, Minister Rory Stewart.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I begin firstly by acknowledging this incredibly important report by Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons and Probation, and secondly by passing my apologies to the House, and in particular to the shadow spokesman, for the fact that they were not able to receive advance notice of the oral statement. So our apologies for that. With permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to make a statement on the findings of this report into the management and supervision of men convicted of sexual offences. Madam Deputy Speaker, sexual offences are amongst the most horrifying and tragic of all the incidents that we have to deal with in this chamber, or indeed in public law. They inflict unspeakable harm on the victims themselves, both at the moment at which the offence is created and lasting harm throughout the individual's life, leading to trauma which in the worst cases can even extend to that individual committing suicide. So nobody should underestimate in any way the seriousness of this type of offence or our obligation as a government or as government agencies to protect the public from sex offences. This is a journey which begins in custody but needs to go right the way through probation into the community. And we are deeply grateful to the work that Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons and Her Majesty's Inspector of Probation has done to look into this specific issue. I've spoken to both inspectors this week, have spoken to the new Director General of Prisons and the new Director General of Probation, who are responsible, and in both cases asked them to look carefully at these reports. I will come back at the end of the speech to go point by point through the major issues raised. But in essence, the central issues relate to the accommodation provision for sex offenders on release. Secondly, the risk assessment process for sex offenders. Thirdly, the way in which professional training ties into that risk assessment process. Fourthly, the opportunities for rehabilitative programmes. And finally, the questions of home visits and, in particular, issues of children. But before we move on to those, Madam Deputy Speaker, and indeed the whole House, I want to take an opportunity to reassure the whole House the overall approach we take to managing sex offenders and, in particular, to public protection. There has been a huge shift, as members and right honourable members will be aware, over the last 20 years in the way that we approach sex offenders. Many more people are now being brought to justice for sex offences than was the case 20 years ago. This does not mean that more people are committing sex offences today. It means that more people are being brought to justice. And this is driven by two things in particular. Firstly, the rise of access to pornography, particularly on the internet, and secondly, the prosecution for individuals for historic sex offences, in some cases, sex offences committed many, many years ago, and the additional priority that, in particular, the police have put on bringing those individuals to justice. We therefore have far more people in prison and in probation who are convicted sex offenders than would have been the case 20 years ago. To run through this very difficult and unpleasant subject, it's also very important to be aware of the range of different people we're talking about when we talk about sex offenders. Some of those individuals have committed a contact offence, some of those have not committed a contact offence. To illustrate that for the House, the range could be, for example, to look at a recent case, could be a 50-year-old autistic man in the north of England who became addicted to internet pornography and was driven to more and more extreme sites and was eventually convicted, because we can now detect people doing this of sex offences, served time in custody, has come out. In that particular case, it is possible to work with the individual to get them off the internet and to reduce their offending. It's possible to protect the public from that kind of individual. But the range of sex offences go right the way through to the most extreme, high-risk cases, which would be dealt with through particular multi-agency protection arrangements. They would include an individual, for example, an adult, who was convicted of raping their partner, and they would have also included, for example, an individual who had been in a position of some authority, perhaps some decades ago, who abused vulnerable children within their care. In thinking about how we deal then with sex offenders in prison and in probation, we need to take into account the fact that these are very different individuals. Some of the oldest individuals that we have in prison are now over 100 years old. Quite clearly, the measures we put in place for them would be different for the type of measures we will put in place for other people. We now need to look particularly, and this is something that I'd be very grateful if we had an opportunity with honourable and right honourable members to discuss in more detail, look at three things in particular that we do to protect the public. The first of those is the multi-agency protection arrangements, so the way that we work with police and probation to make sure that we have a real focus on knowing where an individual is and making sure that they are adhering to the conditions imposed. Secondly, the licence conditions themselves, the licence conditions imposed in most cases of high-risk sex offenders by the parole board. And thirdly, the sex offenders register, which has its own specialised requirements on what can be done with a sex offender. Moving on from that, though, because of the limited time available, I wish to focus particularly in the issues raised by the inspectors in the report. The first of those, which has attracted a great deal of media attention, is around the issue of accommodation provided to offenders. As honourable and right honourable members will have seen in the media, there have been cases highlighted by the inspectors in which sex offenders have been placed in hotel accommodation. First thing I'd like to say is that this is something that we will work very, very hard indeed to avoid in the future, and I'll explain how we'll do that. But before going on to that, let me just explain, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is in a very small number of cases. Every year, over 10,000 people will be released from prison under this form of supervision. Of those 10,000 or more people, 54 of them only, 54, 55, sometimes 56 of them, will end up being in some form of emergency accommodation. Of those individuals, a very, very few, so we're talking here about something like half a dozen, would end up in this form of hotel accommodation. Before they're put in that type of accommodation, the police and probation services will have conducted a very detailed risk assessment and would have ensured that the individual put in that type of accommodation is not an individual who posed a risk of a contact offence to a stranger. So it would be an individual, returning to the beginning of my speech, who had committed a sex offence of the sort that I explained earlier, that was not that type of sex offence, or whose risk factors did not impose that kind of risk on the public. Nevertheless, this is still not something that we should be doing. So with the Director General of Probation, there are two major things that we are doing to address this. The first thing is that we are now providing the resources to build over 200 additional places in approved premises in order to ensure that individuals have approved premise accommodation that they can go to, and in the interim we will be working with organisations like the Langley Trust to provide alternative accommodation. My objective will be to significantly reduce, if not entirely eliminate, the possibility of anyone in future going to that form of hotel accommodation. The second type of issue, Madam Deputy Speaker, that was raised was around the risk assessment mechanism. In terms of the risk assessment mechanism, in particular, criticisms have been made about the ARMS process. So the ARMS process is the monitoring and assessment process which looks at the risk factors which are undertaken in terms of dealing with an offender. In that, there is more that we can do on professional training, but in particular what I've asked the Director General of Probation to do is to look at moving the ARMS process, if possible, out of the community where it has generally been located because of flexible changes in risk, back into the custodial prison environment at an earlier stage of the process. The third thing that was raised, Madam Deputy Speaker, by the inspectors was in relation to approved accommodation. In relation to both approved accommodation and home visits, we must ensure that police and probation visit individuals in their home and that there are no gaps emerging between police and probation. There are many other issues that we need to touch on. I'm aware that Madam Deputy Speaker wishes me to restrict my comments to 10 minutes on a subject that I could speak on for an hour, but I hope perhaps in the questions that we have, we can go back into this subject in more detail. If I can just conclude, we have a huge debt of gratitude to the inspectors for the work that they've done. We need to acknowledge that they have rated our National Probation Service as good, that our public protection mechanisms that I mentioned are among the very best in the world and have been praised by the inspectors, but that there are in particular 4 areas of concern that they've raised. We will be tackling them one by one because there is nothing as important in public protection than protecting people from the horror and the trauma of a sexual offence. Thank you very much indeed.